Spirit of God, when you came into our lives, into this world as Jesus of Nazareth, it turned the world upside down. We seek to understand what was happening and what it means for our life as we read the stories about Him. And so inspire our work this evening. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All righty. So tonight we talk about the Gospels. The four Gospels. We might even mention a couple of other Gospels as we go along the way. And so, as is always the case with me, the first thing I have to do is ask, what are we reading? When we looked at the Hebrew Scriptures, we asked ourselves, were we reading fables or scientific textbooks? Were we reading poetry? Were we reading history? What were we reading? That's always the question you have to ask anytime you open the Bible. What am I reading? So, for instance, the Revelation of John. Some people believe they're reading predictions of the future of the end of the world. Okay? Well, I suppose you can think that. It's apocalyptic literature. It has certain characteristics, and I think it's about politics in the time. We'll talk more about that later, but we always have to ask, what are we reading? So with a gospel, the question is, are we reading historical accounts of Jesus of Nazareth, or aren't we? And that has a bit to do with what are these things written for, where did they come from, so on and so forth, and do they have the same standards for historical accuracy that we do nowadays? So I've hinted at how I look at these things by talking about Spike Lee's movie on Malcolm X. Right? So I'll fill that out a little bit. A number of years ago, Spike Lee made a movie about Malcolm X. He took some of the events in Malcolm X's life and he told the story of Malcolm X moving from a fairly violent approach to protest until he became transformed through a trip to the Far East. His attitude transformed, and in the Spike Lee story, Malcolm X then became somebody who was less violent, more direct, and was working in effect from outside, but working on the system, not trying to burn it down. Now, a lot of people could argue whether or not that is an accurate portrayal of Malcolm X's life, right? But that is how Spike Lee told the story. He took, some of it was legends, he took stories about him, he constructed this story, and the reason he did it was so that African American people could begin to identify with Malcolm X and start to live the way Spike Lee's Malcolm X wanted them to live. Right? He felt it was time to be transformed, to move away from violence, but into very direct action. And that's why he told his story the way he did. And there were anachronisms sometimes. So there was advertising at the time about the movie. And in the advertising, Malcolm was wearing a dashiki. Well, if you remember your history, while dashikis might have been popular in the early 70s, there's no way Malcolm X ever wore one. Right? They put one on him so that he would be identified with the African American people of that time. Right? So Spike Lee, in effect, did with Malcolm X what the gospel authors seek to do with Jesus. Right? So they tell us, each one of these gospel authors tells a story about Jesus. Why are they telling the story? Because they want to make a point. They want you to read about a life of Jesus that will inspire you to live like that Jesus. And each one of those four Gospels are doing that for a different group of people who have different issues, different struggles. Okay? So one of the things you have to ask then is, what's the relationship of these stories about Jesus to the historical truth of who Jesus of Nazareth was? Okay? And one of the things that's been true over the last couple of centuries is that scholars have been debating and arguing about this ad infinitum, and at a certain point you come to the conclusion it is very difficult to know what is historically accurate and what isn't. Right? I'm assuming you all have heard of the Jesus Seminar. Have you? It's a group of scholars that got together probably at this point about 15 years ago and tried to figure out what of the sayings of Jesus in those four Gospels were actually said by Jesus and what weren't. Right? And this group of scholars came out with this book. It's called The Five Gospels. And in it, they have the Gospels put together. And you can see, for instance, you can sort of get that up close. All right? It's color-coded. All right? Now, the black means to these scholars that Jesus didn't say it. The gray means he probably didn't say it. The pink means he probably said it. And the red means, oh yeah, he said that. Okay? So this is the Lord's Prayer. And the only thing that these scholars think that Jesus said was "Our Father." All right? Everything else, they figure it was a tradition that grew up around Jesus. It was, it just wasn't, you couldn't line it back to the historical Jesus. And they have lots of reasons for thinking so. They, if for instance, Jesus sounds too much like a Christian in these texts, they go, well, he couldn't have said that because he wasn't a Christian. He was a Jewish rabbi, for crying out loud. All right? If he sounded too much like the main thrust of Judaism at the time, well, that couldn't have been Jesus because, for crying out loud, he was a revolutionary. He was fighting against. Okay? So what they try and figure out, they try and look into these texts and figure out what the historical Jesus said or didn't say. Right? They try and figure out what texts are historically accurate and what aren't historically accurate. For instance, was Jesus tried by the high priests before Pilate sentenced him to death? All right? Scholars kind of don't think so, because it would have meant that they were doing that on the Sabbath, and it just doesn't make any sense that they would have done that on the Sabbath. So you can see how all of these questions come up that ask, well, when we read these texts, are we actually reading about Jesus of Nazareth, or are we reading a story that the authors put together to make a point so that the people in their communities would know how to live faithfully as followers of this person, Jesus? Right? So that raises the question of integrity. Right? Am I saying, or are those scholars, for instance, saying that people were lying? And the answer is no. Right? Because the Gospels are not historical accounts. The Gospels are stories written so that you will see Jesus in a particular way and follow that Jesus. Okay? Just like Malcolm X made the movie about Malcolm, and you could argue about the historicity of it. All right? Now, I'm giving you pretty mainstream scholarship on the issues of the Gospels and where they came from, whether or not, whether Jesus said particular things or didn't. This is not fringe stuff, right? So the question then is, if they aren't historically accurate, why would I read them? And my answer to that is because they do, in fact, tell me about how I need to live following Jesus. All right? At a certain point, I guess what I'm saying is I don't care if they're historically accurate. I don't think they need to be, right? Any more than I would demand that movie to be exactly historically accurate, right? So, I mean, and this is stuff, I have to tell you, this is stuff that I got in my seminary, which was not a liberal seminary. It's stuff that's taught every year at San Francisco Theological Seminary. Why pastors don't talk about it a lot, I'm not clear, okay? But this is mainstream. It's not on the fringe, right? Now, people do disagree about the details, which things were said, which things weren't said. Some people believe that the historicity of many of the stories is greater than other people, right? But what I would suggest is that it is lost to a point behind the veil of history. I just don't think we can know. And you know, we can take guesses. I can be interested in looking into it. But whether or not the stories are about the historical Jesus, really, it matters less to me than the fact that the stories are there and are inspired to tell me how to live a life of faith following Jesus. Right? That's what the Gospels seem to be. You take them seriously, you got to figure out that you know, that they fit different communities and different purposes, and they even disagree. So, for instance, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of Luke. Jesus goes to Jerusalem once, and at the very end of the story, Jesus goes into the temple, clears it out, and that seems to be the provocation for the crucifixion. That's in the story, the way it turned out that the leaders of the Jewish religion wanted to get him because he came and attacked their power. All right? Gospel of John, not how it worked. First of all, Jesus goes to Jerusalem 3 times in the Gospel of John. And the cleansing of the temple, that happens at the beginning of the story, not at the end. Things don't fit. If you're looking for historical accuracy, I'm not. I'm looking at them as faith documents, as documents that reveal to us what the community came to understand as they lived into the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So, having said that semi-outrageous thing, do you have any questions or any thoughts about that? So having said that, let's talk about these stories and what it is that they might be trying to get across, kind of where they came from. Dave began to allude to some of this. The Gospel of Mark, it appears, was written first. Now, interesting, up until about 200 years ago, it was assumed that the Gospel of Matthew was written first. All right? But then some scholars came along and started doing a statistical analysis of the 4 Gospels. And what they discovered is, if you take Mark, and then you look at Matthew and Luke, you find out that 59% of Matthew is identical to the Gospel of Mark. And 40% of Luke is identical to the Gospel of Mark. All right? And should either one of them disagree with Mark, the other one always agrees. So they conclude, quite logically, that Mark was the first, and that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark on their desk, so to speak, when they were writing the gospel. And they used Mark's gospel as the basic structure. And this is why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels. They are seen together because all three rely on Mark's plot and some of Mark's theological assumptions. Right? The other thing that's interesting is 44% of both Matthew and Luke agree, but aren't seen in Mark. And so people assume there is another source on Matthew and Luke's desk, so to speak, virtual desk. They had the Gospel of Mark there, and they had this other thing, and scholars call it Q. Have you heard of Q?
Yeah.
Scholars say there is a source, and Q actually stands for the German word Quelle, which means source. So it's not a particularly clever name. But and at one point, Marcus Borg actually wrote out what do you think the Q document looked like. All right. So, for instance, what was in Q? The Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer. These are things that Matthew and Luke agree on, and Mark doesn't have any notion of. All right? So just a series of things like that. And most of them seem to be sayings, a couple of small parables, things like that. So Matthew and Luke used Mark and Q as they were formulating their stories. And it's very interesting because if Matthew changes something from Mark, well, you might want to ask why, because it's going to tell you what Matthew's point about Jesus is going to be. You know, there's a whole thing called redaction criticism that scholars try and figure out, well, what was Matthew really trying to get across here? And they do it by comparing it to the others. So that's why they are seen together. They also, Matthew and Luke, have other material. Where did they get it? Did they make it up on their own? Did it come from other oral traditions? We don't know. Okay? So, for instance, Matthew seems particularly...
Do anything, you know that, right?
I'm sorry, what?
We lost you for a minute. The screen went completely black. Did that happen to anybody else too?
No.
No?
No, we're just sitting here and suddenly the screen is gone. We could hear you, but we couldn't see you. And we keep getting a message saying that your bandwidth is low and your picture is freezing for like 1 minute or so at a time.
Yeah, it does freeze.
Oh, that's unfortunate. It is fortunate that I'm recording it, though. Let me just check something.
The picture freezes, but we see you.
Yeah.
I gotta
The
tell
audio
you,
continues.
my speeds right now are screaming fast. So I'm not sure what that's about. But in any case, so I'm happy to repeat what I was saying was that you had Mark, and then Matthew and Luke also had Q, and then both Matthew and Luke had their own sources, right? So, for instance, there's one verse in Mark that says, "And Jesus went down to Jerusalem." And where Mark has that one verse, Luke has 9 chapters, right? It's called the travel narrative. It's got its own outline and structure, and it's where you find, the lost coin and the prodigal son and the unjust judge and all of those great Lucan parables. They're all in the travel narrative. It's like Jesus is trying to train his disciples as they go forward. Okay, so and Luke also has. Dave, you brought up the medical thing.
Mm-hmm.
My professors questioned that, but the other thing about Bible scholars you have to understand, and I've said this before, they all have to get PhDs, which mean they have to disagree with the people before them. Okay? And so if somebody comes up with a new idea, I kind of want to wait for a generation to see if it sticks. Okay? When I talk about the 4-source theory about Mark being in Matthew and Luke and Q being in Matthew, that's 200 years old. I mean, at this point, it's a pretty solid theory. In the same way that the 4 strands of the Pentateuch coming together is about that old as a theory. You know, if something sticks around that long, I'm much more willing to trust scholars on it. It's the new stuff that I wonder about. Matthew has a particular focus on prophecy, and what Matthew does, he reads the prophets through the lens of Jesus, and says, you see back in the Hebrew scriptures, talked about this is how God works, and you can see how clearly this is shown up. The fruition of this prophecy shows up in Jesus of Nazareth. All right? That's what I meant when I said prophet, priest, king, and sage. This is the pinnacle of prophecy. He's the completion of it, particularly in Matthew's mind. Luke and Mark, it doesn't matter to them as much. That's why Luke didn't talk about born of a virgin. You know, that was Matthew's particular thing. I was quoting that passage from Isaiah. So that's where the Gospels come from. That's how they're put together. Each one of the authors had these various sources and sat down to tell a story because they had a community with a particular set of problems. Okay? In Matthew's case, he was looking to make disciples. Right? That's what Matthew's all about, making disciples. And so there's a lot of teaching, and it's structured in 5 parts, like Torah would be. I mean, he's trying to make this the New Jerusalem, the new Jewish religion. Yeah. So each one of them has a particular focus and bent. But what I'd like to do now is to walk through the Gospel of Mark, because all of them, well, certainly the synoptics, I would also claim that this is true for the Gospel of John, but all of them carry some of Mark's assumptions, particularly about the nature of power. Okay? So Mark is telling his story during a time, it is assumed, when there's tremendous political foment. It's moving up towards the time when Rome is just going to get sick of the Jewish people and go in and destroy the Second Temple. Right? It's presumed that Mark's Gospel is written during that period of foment. And so the big question for this community is, where's the power of God in this? How do we see God working? Will God bring about the Messiah to offer Israel its new life as a nation and as an empire? Okay? That's the question that Mark seems to ask. And so he starts with this verse: the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we talked about this image of the sun. The sun in an agricultural community, it's the character of the sun that distinguishes what the estate is going to be like. It's the character of that firstborn son that matters. And so what Mark is telling us is that he's going to tell us a story about the Son of God, about the eldest son of the kingdom of God. All right? And when Jesus starts his ministry in Mark, that's the first thing he does, says the kingdom of God is at hand. All right? So the question is, all through the Gospel of Mark, what's the relationship between the power of the Son of God and the powers of the Roman Empire? Right? Now, the story is told about debates within the Jewish community. The story is told about the Roman Empire back in Jesus' time. But the issue is what's happening in the middle of the political foment and revolt that's going on when Mark is writing his gospel. How do we go about being faithful to Jesus if Jesus is in fact a political Messiah? So he says that right up front, the narrator tells us Jesus Christ is the Son of God. The interesting thing that happens in the Gospel of Mark is nobody gets it until the very end. So the narrator knows, we know, all right? Jesus is baptized. There's a voice from heaven saying, "Thou art my beloved Son, with thee I am well pleased." Okay, God knows. All right, Jesus knows, the narrator knows, I know because I just read what the narrator said. Okay, but there's always this conflict around the nature of the power. Is it God's kingdom that will out, or the Roman kingdom that will out? So one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read about what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God where Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of presence, not just any bread, but the bread of presence, which is not lawful for any but priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, the essential human being, is Lord even of the Sabbath." So Jesus begins ministry in the second chapter, challenging Jewish law. He's saying, look, I'm the Lord of this. I'm going to, I'm paying attention to why these laws were made and interpreting them in that way. And the Pharisees, those who are in charge, are wrong. Right? The Pharisees are interested in the kind of power they have by following the rules, and therefore, in effect, talking God into doing things for them by being good people. Right? If I'm good, will you do what I ask you to do? There's an effort almost to control God this way. So he's challenging the authority of the law. Every time he challenges, though, he then pulls back in the Gospel of Mark. He pushes forward, pulls back. So he challenges the Pharisees, and then in chapter 3, Jesus withdraws with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, also from Judea, and Jerusalem and Idumea, and from beyond the Jordan, and from about Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude, hearing all that he did, came to see him. And he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him, because the crowd was on him, lest they should crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits beheld him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." So God gets it, the narrator gets it, Jesus, we assume, knows, and the unclean spirits know. They understand that the power of God is with this Son, but not anybody else as of yet. Then we move into the fourth chapter. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in a boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great storm of wind arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. You see, that must have meant Peter was an eyewitness. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?" And Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" And they were filled with awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Who is he? They haven't figured it out yet.
Well,
It's
that one's always kind of cracked me up. It's like, how many people can go in a boat where it's, just about tipping over and sleep through it? That just, is mind-boggling to me.
Well, that's where the faith is. And the question is, does it work? All right. I remember once I was by myself paddling a canoe in Long Lake, New York. I was on a camping trip that I was on, and the wind and the waves came up, and I mean to tell you, I was scared.
Yeah.
And I yelled at the top of my lungs, "Peace, be still!" And not a damn thing happened.
Yeah, right.
I did manage to make it to a little island. I was stuck there for 2 days before the storm calmed down. But who was he? Nobody seemed to know. So, moving then into Mark chapter 7. Now when the Pharisees gathered together to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem. Okay, now he doesn't just have the locals, okay? He's gotten big enough and become, in effect, powerful enough that now the lawyers from Jerusalem come out because it's time to challenge him to do something about this itinerant priest. So, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, observing the tradition of the elders and, Dr. Fauci. And when they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they purify themselves. And there are many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups and pots and vessels in bronze. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with hands defiled?" And he said to them, Well did Isaiah prophesy to you, hypocrites, as it is written, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold fast to the tradition of men." Again, Jesus is up against it, suggesting that they are using the law as a way to control other people and their own lives, rather than as a dedication to the presence of God. And why does the Sabbath matter? It matters because it gives life meaning. You have a moment to reflect and be human on the Sabbath day. A moment to be in touch with the presence of God on the Sabbath day. Otherwise, you're just a machine over and over, one day after the other. Really kind of doesn't matter. It's intended to give a moment that gives life meaning in the presence of God. So Jesus' ministry is about being faithful to God. That's what Jesus' teachings are about, and not being faithful to the exact rules that people have come up with to follow. Like, for instance, anything bigger than an olive, you have to say grace. I forget how many feet you're allowed to walk, but there's specific things. And if you use those laws to control people or to put people outside or inside your community, well, then you're not following them as laws that bring you close to God. But if you're using those rules as the rubric, as the way that you open your heart to God, that's different. That's why Jesus is not throwing out the law. He's saying it needs to be used to bring us close to God. Do you know people who keep the Sabbath? It's very interesting to me. My friend Mark Goffney keeps Sabbath, at least he tries. It's fascinating to me to watch how that impacts him when he does it. He's off again, on again. Sometimes he'll take a few months off. But when he's on, it sort of draws him into a moment when he can rest in the presence of God. It reminds me a little of, I had a friend who went to Mass every day. It was as though that spiritual discipline almost built in a cross-resurrection equilibrium in her heart, right? And the keeping of the Sabbath, in the same way, builds in the ability to stand in the presence of God even when everything else is going to hell in a handbasket around you. They're not rules to be followed as though you can earn God's grace. They are rules to be followed so that you can be in the presence of God. That's why God offered them to us. So, conflict with the scribes and the Pharisees, and then Jesus pulls back again in Mark 8. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked the disciples, "Well, who do men say that I am?" And they told him, "Well, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you think I am? And Peter answered, you are the Christ. And he charged them not to tell anybody. Peter comes about as close as anybody. Okay? Not the Son of God, but the Christ, that would be to say the messianic figure. All right? Not necessarily God's the firstborn of the kingdom of heaven, all right? But a kind of political leader that is moving them forward. They kept hoping for it and looking for it. He was close, but didn't quite get there. And then Jesus says, listen, he began to teach them that the Son of Man, the essential human being, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not on the side of God, but on the side of men. Now, Peter was not understanding the nature of God's rule. I said at the beginning that this is about power. The difference between God's power and a political power that's in conflict with the people of Israel. And so Peter's saying, well, what do you mean you're going to be killed and rise again? No, you're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the one that's supposed to bring us victory. That's what he's hoping for in this story. And he doesn't understand that the Christ must suffer and die. So from there, Jesus moves into the final conflict with the rulers, with the leaders and rulers. He goes in and he turns over the money changers' tables, and you know that story. He goes in and gets a whip and throws everybody out and says, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, sought a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the multitude was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So again, direct conflict, back out to a reflection of who it is and who isn't. Comes back in the next day. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and scribes, understands the chief priests now, not just scribes coming out of town, and the elders came to him. They said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them? And they sent him some of the, so then the Pharisees kept going, and then they sent him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to entrap him in his talk. And with that little interchange, they did the whole thing with the taxes of Caesar that I don't really want to go through right now. But finally, this conflict comes to a head. His disciples are looking for some kind of a move on Jesus's part that will empower the people of Israel and stand up against the Roman Empire, which is the biggest power on earth. All right? But still no one's understood him, so he's arrested and he's tried. And then he is put to death on the cross. And on the cross in chapter 15, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of the bystanders hearing it said, behold, he's calling Elijah. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar to put on a reed and give it to him to drink, saying, wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion saw it, who stood facing it, he saw it, and thus he saw that he had just breathed his last. And the centurion said, truly this man was the Son of God. Finally, somebody gets it. He gets it when Jesus is on the cross. God's power is about moving through death to new life. It is not about coercion. It is not the power that human beings force on one another. God's power has to do with attraction, with the healing and the love and the kindness that had people flocking from all over to see Jesus in this story. It has nothing to do with the coercive power that was seen in the Roman Empire. That's about as strong a pacifistic stance in the scripture that I can find. So quickly, on to that basic structure that Mark had. Luke adds a kind of, well, you know that there are two parts to Luke. There's Luke and there's Acts. They're part one and part two of the same book. Okay? And the layer that Luke adds onto it is almost a militaristic campaign that happens over time, right? The gospel, that is to say, this power of God that moves from death to new life, right? It moves from Galilee to Jerusalem. So from the backwaters to the capital of the Jewish world in the Gospel of Luke. And in the book of Acts, it moves from Jerusalem to Rome, the capital of the known world. Right? And so Luke adds that drive. And every time something is in the way of that campaign, there are two things that are present that break through it. And the first thing is prayer, and the second thing is the Holy Spirit. All right, so when there was a big argument among the disciples in Jerusalem about whether you had to follow Jewish law in order to be a Christian, all right, there was prayer, and the Spirit came and showed Peter in a dream what he needed to do, and it broke the log jam, at least in the story, and let the Spirit move forward, so that the gospel is always on the move in Luke. And Luke is really focused on the power of prayer and the power of the Spirit. Okay? And Matthew, as I said earlier, puts a particularly Jewish take on this. He's the one that has us turning our eyes towards the Hebrew Scriptures and asking, well, we can see God's work in those Hebrew Scriptures, and look how it finds its fruition here in this story about Jesus of Nazareth. Those are the broad sweeps of those three Gospels. But then we get to the Gospel of John. I wish Jack were here. Okay, he's going to have to listen to this later, because I read Jack's website. I don't know. Have any of you read Jack's website?
Yeah.
All right. So Jack and I share something. We both think that the church has done a horrible job of trying to retool its mission and message given modernism. Okay, Jack's decided he wants to get rid of the Gospel of John as part of that project. I told him that that my goal while I'm here at Rockville is to convince him that the Gospel of John is in fact the one he wants to keep. Okay, I love the Gospel of John. And it has a particularly, it's particularly helpful, I think, for our day, for our problems. You know, each of these Gospels were written for particular communities with particular issues. Right? And there's some ways in which the Gospel of John addresses our issues. Okay? So it begins, instead of with a birth narrative, it begins with the Logos. Okay? So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? Well, what is Logos? All right, Logos is Greek for word. Right? But I mean to tell you, when the Gospel of John picked that word, okay, now my connection is unstable. Can you see me now?
Yeah, we lost you for a minute or so. Whatever you said. The
Yeah,
past
whatever you
minute.
said.
Okay, so the Logos is the Word.
Mhm.
And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so where does that come from? So in Stoic philosophy at the time, the logos was the structure of reason in Greek philosophy. So that's one way the word was used. Okay, words just, it always means ideas, right? Words are the way we communicate ideas. All right. And then the first three words of this gospel are in the beginning. So it's moving back to creation. And then I read to you, and I'll read it again, part of Proverbs 8 when we were doing the wisdom literature. Ages ago, that's wisdom, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. You got the idea. Okay? There's a way in which logos is wisdom. It resonates with the prologue. Some feminist scholars are legitimately concerned that by removing the feminine character of wisdom and giving it the word logos, that John made a sexist move. That is to say, a move that limited our capacity to understand the fullness of God as having both masculine and feminine energies and traits. I don't think that John did that quite deliberately. That was his time and his age. I do think that the critique is real enough and good enough that we need to pay attention to the broad scriptures that help us to embrace other aspects of the divine and not lose what could potentially be lost in John's gospel. But the other thing that's going on in the Gospel of John is that the Gnostics, so Gnostics are people that think the key to salvation is a special knowledge.
Lost you.
Yep, all gone.
Okay, am I here now?
We've lost you, Sam.
No voice.
This is weird, because do you have me now?
Yeah, just started up.
Okay, it's really strange because it's like it cuts out and then I'm got screaming fast speeds. So, in any case, but the Gnostics believe that salvation happens when we have special knowledge that comes down from heaven that allows us to reach up towards the heavens. Okay, and if you look at the Gospel of John, the Logos, it's as though the Logos comes in and becomes flesh, all right, and then moves towards the heavens. So there's a way in which the Gospel of John tries to get a hold of those ideas too, when he says that the Logos becomes flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us, full of grace and truth, and we have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son of the Father. It's as though all of this is subsumed in the nature of this Christ. It's the patterns of creation that connect. It's the templates, the driving creative force that opens up. And this became flesh and dwelled among us so that we too could be children of God. Right? That's what it says. So the Logos, it's we too. Right? So what I say is one of the reasons that I resist thinking about miracles as magic tricks that God does is because the point here is that the Logos became flesh in Jesus. The Logos becomes flesh in you and in me. I mean, that's why the story is being told. It's not being told so you will know that Jesus is cool. It's being told so that you'll know that you are expected to follow in the way. And the way is the way that Jesus has led. the Logos becomes flesh, that creative template becomes in flesh. It does in Jesus's life, it does in your life, in my life. You know, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says that all of the things that he did, you'll do all of it and more. Right? It's not seen as something that's only for Jesus. The Gospel of John is providing a way for us to express the love and creative power of the God that created all things. Big bang to Shakespeare. That Logos has been driving creation forward, and you and I have both the opportunity and the responsibility to act upon it and express it. It's why I wish Jack would like the Gospel of John. It's so hopeful. I mean, think about it. You are Logos enfleshed. You are an expression of that love that brought creation into being. And every one of us has our own way of expressing that, our own sphere of influence, and that's our responsibility and our joy, is to live out that unique expression of the love of God. And we do that through our life and through our death. I'll leave you with this last thing, atonement theories about, Jesus' death and resurrection and what happens. I think there are 27 of them in the Christian scriptures. But one of the ones in the Gospel of John is at the end when Jesus has died, they put a lance in his side, and out comes blood and water. Okay? Well, by the time, John is a very symbolic gospel, and by the time we get there, we know that blood is life and water is spirit, and that's as clear as a bell. Okay? And so what happens when we die? Life force and spirit is poured out into the world, as if to say, this is how it regenerates. This is how God carries it forward. We live faithfully, we die, and the love of God explodes from that moment. It's a pretty cool story.
How do you talk to people who are literalists?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think what I'd say is that, I guess I would need to know from them, are they comfortable in their faith? Or are they shaky in it? Some people who are literalists desperately want you to believe what they believe, because if you don't, then they doubt it. Okay? I mean, there's an insecurity in that faith. And if that's the case, then asking questions, suggesting that that there is light on the other side, that I'm not denigrating faith here, but I also don't need to shake anybody's faith if it's helpful. It's like my father will listen. My father's going to listen to this Bible class. Okay, that's what he's doing. He's watching them. I'll cut this part out, and then we will have the same argument, about because where he has trouble is when I say we're all Logos and flesh. But what I say to his dad, if you're happy where your faith is, you don't even have to listen to me. I'm all for you being happy where your faith is. So I guess that's what I'd say, Carlos, is I don't need to convince anybody. But if people are shaky in their faith, then I guess the way to do it is to ask questions. And you got to build trust, because you got to give them respect for being where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's at least what I try to do, because, as I've said and I will say over and over again, I'm not right. I once had a long discussion about these things with my cousin, Dawn, who goes to an evangelical church, And she was interested in listening and arguing, so on and so forth. And at the end of it, I just looked at her and I said, but you know, Dawn, I could be completely wrong about all of this. And it's important for us to admit that, because we're talking about the greatest mystery there is, the God about which naught can be said because it's too far beyond comprehension. So how could I possibly claim to be right? That would be arrogant, and I'm unwilling to do that. I can tell you that I can tell you what I think, that I'm comfortable where I am and why, but I'm not going to claim an absolute right. If I have challenged your faith and you want to talk about it, you should feel free to get in contact with me and we will talk. Because I don't wish to take the moorings out of anybody's faith. I don't intend to do that. All right. Thank you all very much.